The situation with my husband's family reached a breaking point when he finally decided to cut ties with his toxic mother and sister. Their outright audacity to demand that we give up our dream house for my sister-in-law's unemployed husband, who is a gaming addict, and their 6 children was the last straw. My in-laws have maintained a deeply unhealthy relationship with my husband, and this dynamic is starting to impact my life as well. Throughout his childhood, my husband was the favored child in his family, often referred to as the golden child. His mother was extremely close to him, especially since his father worked long hours. They spent significant time together, which created a strong bond between them. However, from my observations, his sister Sarah has not received the same kind of attention or care from their mother. While I know that Jacob's mom loves both of her children, it's evident to me that she consistently favors my husband. This favoritism has likely affected Sarah throughout their lives, and it is also the reason why Jacob has always tried to be a good older brother to her, stepping in to support her whenever he can. However, both Sarah and their mother sometimes displayed behavior that crossed the line into the absurd. For instance, when Jacob and I first started dating, he was a recent college graduate living at home with his family, including Sarah. His parents provided him with a separate floor in their home to ensure he had privacy and the ability to invite guests over. This is how I ended up spending the night there on multiple occasions. Despite the provided privacy, there were many mornings when Sarah would barge into our room without knocking, disregarding any boundaries. On several occasions, we were still asleep or not properly dressed, but she treated the situation as if it were completely normal, starting random conversations with Jacob. This behavior made me uncomfortable, particularly because I was not wearing much and felt exposed. While I understood that Jacob was living at home, I found it completely unreasonable that she would enter our room without knocking. It seemed like a fundamental act of respect to me. I initially discussed my discomfort with Jacob and expressed that I would not return to his house until he installed a lock on his door. He agreed, wanting to protect our privacy. The next morning, despite the lock being installed, Sarah tried to barge in again and started yelling at us for having the door locked. She banged on the door and demanded that Jacob let her in. Of course, he eventually gave in and opened the door, but what unfolded was shocking. Sarah stormed into the room and immediately questioned Jacob about the lock. When she spotted me, she pointed and shouted, blaming our situation on me and calling me derogatory names. Her rudeness was appalling. Jacob attempted to explain that he had requested the lock for our own comfort and peace, clarifying that he needed space during the night. However, Sarah was not satisfied with his answer. She insisted that siblings should share everything and not have secrets. Jacob calmly reassured her that the only reason for the lock was to prevent her from barging in when we were sleeping, pointing out that it was indeed disturbing. In a fit of anger, Sarah turned on me, insisting that I was coming between her and her brother. Being naturally non-confrontational, I felt overwhelmed and decided to excuse myself to the bathroom. While I was gone, I could hear her continuing to yell, with Jacob trying to calm her down. Once she finally left, Jacob came to comfort me, clearly upset about her behavior, and promised to talk to her again so that she could apologize. The following weekend, when I visited again, Sarah did approach me to apologize. Her excuse for her rudeness was weak. She claimed she needed to speak to Jacob urgently and felt it was acceptable to intrude. Jacob stood firm and told her not to disturb us again, and she nodded meekly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Though this particular incident was addressed, it was clear that Sarah had exhibited other strange behaviors towards Jacob, which made me wary of the dynamic in their family. When disagreements arose between Jacob and me, even about trivial matters like movies, Sil would make her presence known in a way that felt intrusive. If she was around during our discussions, she would often jump in and assert that Jacob should be dating someone who shared his interests and preferences, insisting that I was obviously not the right match for him. Despite Jacob casting her disapproving glances, Sil would merely smirk as if she found her comments amusing. Another uncomfortable situation occurred when Sil would pry into my past. Jacob and I had been open and honest about our histories from the start, but I didn't feel comfortable sharing intimate details with his sister. Regardless of my discomfort, Sil would ask probing questions that felt invasive, such as why my previous relationship had ended or if I hadn't been good enough for my ex. On top of that, she would make hurtful comments, like stating that Jacob's former girlfriend was much prettier than I was. These pointed inquiries and remarks would often happen when we were alone, leading me to suspect that Sil was intentionally trying to undermine my confidence. At first, I chose to stay silent about this behavior, but as it continued, I eventually reached my limit. One day, I decided to respond to her taunts by telling her that I actually preferred my ex-boyfriend's family over Jacob's because they weren't intrusive like Sil seemed to be. The surprise on Sil's face was noticeable, and for a while, it seemed to silence her. What I said had a ring of truth to it. While my relationship with Jacob was evolving, my own mother-in-law, Mill, was no better than Sil. Initially, Mill would ignore me. However, once she recognized that Jacob and I were serious about our relationship, her attitude shifted to one of hostility. It was as if she felt threatened by my presence, leading her to act as though I didn't exist during family dinners and gatherings. Jacob sometimes noticed this and attempted to discuss it with Mill, but her behavior never changed. There was even a moment when she labeled me as stuck-up and spoiled merely because my parents had the means to send me to a private school while she worked as a public school teacher. Mill even tried to persuade Jacob to reconsider marrying me, suggesting that he should look for someone better suited for him. Fortunately, Jacob stood firm in his feelings for me and went ahead and proposed despite their objections. When Mill and Sil learned about the engagement, they reacted with shock and concern. They both called me to express their belief that Jacob was making a terrible mistake and that I should end the relationship and return the ring. Their request baffled me, and I refused to engage in such a conversation. I loved Jacob and wanted to build a life together, so their attempts to manipulate our choices felt completely inappropriate. When they realized I was not easily swayed, Mill switched her approach, telling me to be the best wife for Jacob and take care of him just like she had done over the years. I found her comment offensive but chose not to react strongly. Sil, on the other hand, accused me of being a gold digger and insisted that her brother deserved someone of higher status. She threatened to expose me before the wedding, hoping to ruin our plans entirely. After that unsettling conversation, I felt the need to talk to Jacob about everything that had happened. He was shocked by the rudeness of his family toward me and confronted them, but Mill and Sil stood firm in their belief that I was not good enough for Jacob. He encouraged me to ignore their opinions and reassured me of his love, but deep down, I felt saddened that his family could not accept me. Jacob and I had already decided to finance our own wedding, so when Mill offered to pay for half of our expenses, we politely declined. Jacob explained how hard we had worked to save for this special occasion. Instead of feeling happy for us, Mill became upset, expressing sadness over the belief that Jacob didn't need her anymore. In contrast, Jacob's dad exhibited a sense of pride in our accomplishments and relationship. He was calm and supportive, unlike his mother and sister, and never expressed any reservations about our future together. Our relationship had generally been smooth, and we had not faced any significant issues until my future sister-in-law, Sil, began to express her concerns to Jacob. To maintain peace, we decided to ask her if she would like to take charge of organizing our rehearsal dinner. She accepted the offer, and we were grateful for her willingness to contribute to our special day. However, as the wedding date got closer, unexpected problems started to surface. The first sign of trouble came when Sil invited herself to dinner with us. She told Jacob how much she missed him, which made us think she genuinely wanted to spend quality time with her brother. Since Jacob and I had just moved in together after our engagement, I reluctantly agreed to the dinner, as I didn't want to come across as rude to someone who would soon be my family. During the meal, things took a strange turn. Sil suddenly began discussing her strong feelings about cheating, expressing how much she detested cheaters and referring to them as useless. Jacob and I exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of where she was going with her rant. Then, she looked directly at me and asked how it felt to be a useless piece of trash. I was taken aback, furrowing my brows in confusion as I tried to grasp the meaning behind her words. Without warning, Sil escalated the situation, accusing me of having an affair with my co-worker, Zach. Jacob immediately questioned her about what she meant, and that was when Sil proudly started to wave around pictures she claimed proved her suspicions. I felt a mix of disbelief and irritation. I had never been unfaithful to Jacob. I had remained completely loyal to him since the beginning of our relationship. As I glanced at the photographs, they appeared entirely innocent. While Zach and I shared a close working relationship, it was purely professional. We had started at the company around the same time and looked out for each other to avoid any consequences from our boss. What Sil was trying to turn into evidence of an affair was nothing more than friendly moments captured in those photos. I felt a wave of anger wash over me as I realized she was trying to damage my reputation and create unnecessary tension between Jacob and me. Before I could defend myself, Jacob, clearly shocked and upset by the accusations, stepped in to protect me. He confronted Sil, asking why she was following me around and taking pictures without my consent. Sil attempted to justify her actions, claiming she wanted to investigate me because she didn't believe I belonged to a status worthy enough to marry Jacob. She suggested that I was after his money and that she felt compelled to look into my life. Jacob firmly told her that her claims were entirely unfounded and that she was creating unnecessary drama. He tried to make her see reason and urged her to stop spreading lies that could threaten our relationship. However, Sil only got louder, insisting that Jacob needed to open his eyes to the supposed affair. As the situation became more tense with her continued accusations, I reached my breaking point. I told Sil that I would consider filing a police report against her for taking my pictures and stalking me. The look on her face was one of shock as she processed what I had just said. She asked if I was serious, and I responded that I had evidence of her unlawful actions and that she had crossed a line with her unfounded allegations. In a desperate attempt to defend herself, Sil turned to Jacob, pleading with him to understand that her intentions were purely protective and that she never thought her actions would escalate to this point. She stressed that if I filed charges, it would impact her work and future. I told her firmly that the responsibility to fix this situation lay with her. When she asked me what I wanted, I made it clear that I was not going to file a case at that moment. However, the damage had been done, and I felt a deep sense of betrayal from someone who was supposed to become a part of my family. I had made the decision not to pursue any legal action against her, provided that she kept her distance from my life. At this moment, there was nothing Sil could do to escape the consequences of her actions. She glanced over at her brother, Jacob, who stood by my side. He supported my choice and told her that she should be thankful I was willing to let the situation go, considering how clearly wrong her behavior had been. Reluctantly, Sil agreed to stay away from me. Since that day, our communication ceased, and it has remained that way. Jacob continued to have a relationship with her, but Sil never dared to reach out to me again. The next incident occurred the night before our wedding during the rehearsal dinner. Sil had insisted on managing the dinner herself, refusing our help in any way. She expressed that she wanted to take care of everything. However, when we arrived, it quickly became clear that things were not as we had expected. The dinner was set up with plastic tablecloths on picnic tables, and the food consisted of cold Mexican dishes. Throughout the evening, Sil behaved in a way that felt off and upset, which cast a shadow over the celebration. As the night went on, she consumed too much alcohol and began acting inappropriately around the other guests. She repeatedly expressed her eagerness for the wedding to be over, claiming it was too stressful, despite the fact that she had not contributed to any of the planning or expenses. As the atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable, my father-in-law, Jacob's dad, became fed up and eventually escorted Sil out of the venue. Jacob's sister tried to defend their mother's behavior, but my father-in-law would not listen. It was, without a doubt, a complete disaster, and I began to panic, fearing that both women would find a way to ruin my wedding the following day. That night, Jacob and I had our first serious argument. I firmly stated that he needed to uninvite both Sil and Sil since it was clear that their behavior would only lead to drama and upstaging during our wedding ceremony. Jacob was very resistant and tried to reassure me that his father would be there to handle the situation and that he wouldn't allow them to misbehave. In response to his lack of understanding, I felt compelled to issue a serious ultimatum: if he did not uninvite his mother and sister, there would be no wedding the following day. Jacob looked taken aback by my demand, and I was fully aware of how harsh I sounded. However, my anxiety over what Sil and Mill might do loomed large in my mind. I could not bear the thought of being embarrassed in front of my family and friends on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. I recognized that Jacob had weak boundaries, but I hoped this ultimatum would help him realize how much their behavior was affecting our relationship. Thankfully, Jacob came to understand my concerns and made the right decision. Early the next morning, he called his father to inform him that his mother and sister were uninvited. To my surprise, Jacob's father did not seem shocked by this news. He assured Jacob that he would ensure Mill and Sil would not show up uninvited. However, shortly after that conversation, both Mill and Sil began bombarding Jacob with phone calls, desperately trying to persuade him to let them attend the wedding. Jacob stood firm, explaining to them that after their behavior toward me throughout our relationship, he felt uncomfortable including them on our special day. Hearing this, Mill retaliated by claiming that I was a terrible woman for coming between her and her son. Sil also attempted to argue with him, but Jacob remained resolute. While I felt guilty that Jacob's mother couldn't attend the wedding due to her own actions, my feelings of guilt vanished when I learned something shocking from Jacob's cousins. They revealed to me that Sil and Mill had been planning to wear white dresses to our wedding. In a family group chat that only included women, Sil encouraged others to wear white as well, arguing that the bride shouldn't be the only one wearing that color. I was taken aback by how low they were willing to stoop to hurt me. After discovering this, I felt relieved that they were uninvited. Jacob did miss his family, but he also recognized the validity of my feelings. Overall, our wedding day turned out to be beautiful and joyous, free from the drama that Sil and Mill might have brought. The day of our wedding was truly wonderful, and I felt grateful that no one attempted to take the spotlight away from us. However, since that day, Mill and Sil have completely stopped communicating with me, which honestly brought me a sense of relief. I was quite comfortable with their silence, as it allowed me and Jacob to enjoy our life together without any unnecessary drama. Their only interaction with my husband happened on special occasions or when they invited him over for dinner, which I didn't mind at all. In contrast, Phil remained kind and continued to maintain contact with me over the years, which I appreciated. Jacob and I worked hard, saving our money diligently. This year, we reached a significant milestone: we bought our first house. The excitement we felt about owning something so substantial was hard to put into words. To celebrate this achievement, Jacob's parents and Sil came over for a small housewarming party. However, to avoid any awkwardness with them, I chose to visit my own parents and spend quality time with my family instead. Now, let's get to the main concern. Last month, out of nowhere, my mother-in-law called me. This was quite unexpected, given that we hadn't spoken since the day I married Jacob. To my surprise, she casually inquired about how I had been and what my life was like. Although I was initially taken aback by her sudden interest, I answered her questions as best I could. Then she proceeded to ask how I felt about living in such a spacious house when it was just Jacob and me. Her words stung, as Jacob and I had been trying to conceive for quite some time but faced challenges with infertility. We had both accepted our situation, even though it was disappointing. I had told Jacob many times that if he wished, he could leave me and find someone else to have children with. But he always reassured me that he loved me and was content with our life together, even without kids. Our families were aware of this sensitive topic, which is why Mill's comments felt pointed and unnecessary. Then, Mill dropped another bombshell: my sister-in-law was pregnant again. This news shocked me, especially since it was her 6th child. I knew from Jacob that her husband was unemployed and had a careless attitude regarding their family planning, which had resulted in multiple unexpected pregnancies. I couldn't help but feel frustration at how my sister-in-law was treated by her husband. Jacob had shared that her partner did little to help around the house, relying on her to juggle multiple part-time jobs while he spent his days playing video games. It was hard to understand how my sister-in-law tolerated this. She never seemed to consider leaving him, despite the numerous conversations we had about her situation. Mill continued with her point, proposing that since my sister-in-law didn't have the means to work during her pregnancy, it would be sensible for Jacob and me to move out of our home, as it was too large for a childless couple like us. Taken aback by this suggestion, I struggled to process what I was hearing. I asked her if she was joking, but she insisted she was serious. She believed that my sister-in-law and her husband deserved to have a bigger house, and since Mill didn't have space in her own home, she thought they could move in with us. The weight of this proposal hung heavily in the air, and I fought to gather my thoughts amid a whirlwind of emotions. I explained to Mill that this was our home, one that we were still paying for, and the idea of someone moving in without even asking for our permission felt intrusive and entirely unreasonable. I made it clear to her that I would be more than willing to host my sister-in-law and her husband for a few days, should that be their wish. However, I drew the line at allowing them to move in with me permanently. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, did not take this news well. She raised her voice in anger, insisting that as a dutiful daughter-in-law, it was my responsibility to make room for my sister-in-law and her husband. She argued that if I complied with her demands, all the past disagreements and tensions would be forgotten. Frustrated, I responded to her, expressing my willingness to let them stay but pointing out the reality of our financial situation. I reminded her that we were still making payments on our home. I knew that if my sister-in-law and her husband moved in, they would not contribute to the mortgage or the bills. Hence, I proposed that she should take some responsibility and help with the costs. I told her that I would be more than happy if she could cover just the mortgage while we managed the bills. I was well aware that with her single job, she wouldn't be able to afford the mortgage alone, so I asked her directly when she planned to get a second job to help pay off the debt. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law exploded in rage, shouting and expressing her outrage over what she considered an unreasonable request. I countered her accusations by pointing out that it was equally absurd for her to expect us to take care of my sister-in-law's family by allowing them to move into our home without any financial contribution. This further infuriated her, and the yelling continued while I remained calm, even managing to smile at the situation. She eventually ended the call when it became clear that I would not relent to her demands. Shortly after, my sister-in-law called, screaming at me for having the audacity to ask her mother to pay our mortgage. She accused me of being a gold digger, and I shot back, telling her the real gold digger was her, trying to move in with us without lifting a finger to help. I reminded her that if she wanted to find the true source of the problem, she should look at her partner, who did nothing to support her. This response seemed to silence her. I firmly stated that while she could argue with me all she wanted, I was never going to allow her family to live in our home unless they were prepared to contribute to the mortgage. She labeled me as heartless and claimed I was prioritizing money over family. In that moment, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had stood my ground and regained control over my own home, refusing to be walked over. However, I couldn't shake off a lingering guilt as I thought about my ex-husband. I found myself on Reddit, questioning whether my actions made me the bad person in this situation. As an update, I expressed my gratitude to everyone who offered support. Many had asked why my mother-in-law would make such unreasonable demands. It stemmed from her deeply entitled nature. My husband had let her behavior go unchecked for too long, and I knew we needed to have a serious discussion about this. It was troubling to realize how my mother-in-law could manipulate her own son to get what she wanted. My sister-in-law, unfortunately, was just a pawn in this game, always seeking her mother's approval, hoping that by siding with her, she could receive the same favor. In this case, my sister-in-law stood to benefit from moving in with us, relying on us to cover her expenses and care for her children, all while her partner contributed nothing. I was waiting for my husband to return from his business trip so we could finally discuss this matter. I felt it was too significant to talk about over the phone. In a second update, I noted that 3 days had passed since my last entry. When my husband finally returned, we sat down to talk, and I explained how his mother had called me insisting that we give up our house for his sister and her family. He looked shocked and asked for the full story. When I shared everything with him, he admitted that he was completely unaware of the situation. The only thing his mother had mentioned to him before his trip was that his sister was pregnant, and he had no idea she would make such a bold request. He had no clue that she would make such outrageous demands. I firmly told him that I expected him to have a conversation with Mill about the situation and that it needed to be addressed because I simply could not manage his family's issues on my own. He agreed and called Mill while I was present. He confronted her directly, asking why she had lied to me about him. Caught in her deception, Mill attempted to backtrack, claiming that she hadn't exactly lied. She insisted that she believed he would have no issue with his sister living with us, so she thought it was best to take matters into her own hands and approach me directly. Jacob interrupted her mid-sentence, asking why she assumed he would be perfectly fine with Sil and her entire family moving in. Mill replied that since he and Sil were close, of course, he would want to help her by allowing her family to stay with us. As I listened to this exchange, I felt a wave of frustration wash over me, and I closed my eyes to collect my thoughts, choosing to remain silent because it was essential for Jacob to handle his mother. My husband then asserted firmly that he would not permit Sil, her jobless husband, and her 6 children to move into our home. He made it clear that Mill had no right to put that pressure on us. This only led Mill to raise her voice, arguing that Sil really needed help at that moment. Jacob countered, stating that it was not our responsibility to step in and take care of them. He claimed that if Mill felt their situation was urgent, she should take that responsibility upon herself. Mill then began to argue that Phil, Sil's husband, didn't want to get involved because their house was too small for everyone. She pointed out our spacious home and suggested it would be easy for us to help. She even went as far as to say that since I did not have children, I could look after Sil's kids, and this would provide me with a sense of fulfillment. My eyes widened in disbelief at her comment, and I observed my husband's face turning red with anger for the first time during this conversation. In a loud voice, he told her that she had no right to say something so thoughtless about me, making it clear that she could not use my situation to pressure me into taking care of Sil's children. He continued by stating that Phil was justified in not wanting anything to do with Sil since she had become somewhat of a childbirthing machine, and that he was completely done with both Sil and Mill. Mill attempted to soften her approach, but Jacob continued to raise his voice, explaining that he had made every effort to maintain a good relationship with them, even after they treated me with disrespect multiple times. He emphasized that he could no longer tolerate such behavior. Mill began to beg him to reconsider, but Jacob stood his ground, stating that this was our home, I was his wife, and anyone who disrespected me also disrespected him. He concluded by asserting that they did not deserve a place in his life. With those final words, he ended the call. Since that day, he has had no contact with either Sil or Mill. Phil did reach out to Jacob later to discuss the situation, but after hearing the full story, he understood Jacob's decision and even apologized to me on behalf of his wife. I told him it was not his fault. In the weeks that followed, things took an interesting turn. Many people suggested that I set up cameras around our home, just in case Mill and Sil decided to show up and make a scene. Following their advice, I ordered cameras online and installed them around the property. As luck would have it, last weekend, they decided to knock on my door while I was home alone. I noticed them on the camera and immediately called Jacob, who assured me he was on his way. When I opened the door, there stood Mill and Sil, looking furious. They demanded that I let them inside, but I stood firm and refused, telling them that if they had something to say, they could say it from outside. Mill began yelling, calling me heartless and accusing me of being greedy and selfish. I remained calm and replied that this was our home, and they had no right to barge in uninvited. As Mill continued her rant, she was unaware that the cameras were capturing every moment. I reminded her of our previous conversation and reiterated that I would not be giving up my home for Sil and her husband. I told her that if she wanted to discuss anything further, she would need to wait for Jacob to return. Sil, meanwhile, was yelling that I was breaking up the family for no good reason and that I was being too stubborn. I was being too stubborn, and she made it clear to me that not only did she believe I was a gold digger, as she had always suspected, but now she also accused me of trying to take her brother away from their family. I stood my ground and informed them that everything they were saying was being recorded on our cameras. I planned to use this evidence to get a restraining order against them, which would mean they could not come within 50 feet of our house. The shock on their faces was evident, their eyes widened as Mill yelled at me, claiming I wouldn't dare go that far. I smirked at her, feeling confident in my stance, and told her that if they did not leave our property immediately, she would soon receive a legal order requiring her to stay away. This seemed to scare them straight, as my sister-in-law started to downplay the situation, insisting that I was overreacting and that it wasn't a big deal. Fortunately, at that moment, Jacob arrived. He approached us calmly and asked Mill what they were doing at our house. Mill rushed to hug him in an attempt to gain his support, but he deflected her embrace and firmly reiterated his question to her and Sil about their presence. Sil began to speak, claiming that they knew I was trying to control Jacob's life by preventing him from talking to them, and that they had come to confront me about it. I rolled my eyes at how ridiculous they sounded. Jacob quickly clarified to both Mill and Sil that it was his choice to go no contact with them, and he did not want any relationship with either of them. At that point, Mill began to plead with him for forgiveness, but Jacob remained firm and told them they needed to leave our property. He warned them that if they did not, he would have no choice but to call the police. Their shocked expression showed they did not expect him to react this way. Jacob continued to assert that if they ever returned to our house, we would feel free to involve law enforcement and have them forcibly removed. They looked devastated by his words, but Jacob was done caring about their feelings. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing my husband was finally standing up for me in this situation. Eventually, both Mill and Sil left, still fuming with anger. Afterward, Jacob talked with Phil, who was just as shocked as we were that Mill and Sil had appeared at our home unannounced. He assured us that we had made the right decision by not letting them in, and he expressed his growing frustration with their behavior. I knew that with Jacob being so firm during the confrontation and insisting they leave, they would think twice before stepping foot on our property again. If they did, I would not hesitate to contact a lawyer and send them a formal notice. I felt grateful that my husband finally recognized how toxic his family could be, and I hoped this would lead to a more peaceful life for us. I wanted this to be my last update on the matter, as I was eager to move forward and put this situation behind us.